Hello, we are live today with Andreas Wettstein on our LinkedIn Live for strategy for SMEs. And before we get started, maybe Andreas, should we do a quick introduction?
Yeah, let's do that. Should I start? Yeah, I'll start.
Go ahead.
So this is the real strategy expert. Let's put it straight here. The real strategy expert in this call is Marc, but I contacted him to do this LinkedIn Live because I really like what he does, and I need strategy. I need a good understanding of strategy for the work I do with SMEs. So I work with SMEs. I help them with overcoming obstacles of growth. So if they reach a certain plateau, then I start working with them. And we typically start with strategy work. So my specialty is really companies that are 10 to 50 employees. So that's my field. Marc,
Yeah,
up to you.
great, thanks. Yeah, so as you said, I'm a strategy advisor. I've been doing this for some 20 years now. And I tend to work with organizations that are a little bit larger, I would say. So they kind of start with 50 and very often in its divisions, business units, country organizations, subsidiaries of larger groups. Right? And so although they are part of larger groups, usually, as I said, they have a size of like 50 to maybe 2,000, 3,000 employees. A lot of them are around a couple hundred, I would say like 200, 300 people. And so we wanted to discuss a little bit strategy and maybe also what is kind of a difference, or does it need a different type of strategy or approach to strategy when it comes to SMEs compared to corporates. And Andrea, so I mean, working with SMEs, so would you say that they need a strategy at all? Or oftentimes we hear that, oh, we don't need a strategy, or it's too complicated, we don't have time. What is your take on that?
Well, my take on this is that when a company is relatively slow, they can do without a strategy. Let's say if you start going into a business, actually, I even recommend against going too much into doing strategy, because what you need when you're small is you need to have an idea, you need to have a market, and you need to have a way to deliver that market. And typically, when you're small, you can get to a certain size without having a strategy. Okay? We will have to discuss what we actually mean by strategy. But to me, an SME needs a strategy at that point where where there is a risk of losing focus, when there is a risk of not using your resources correctly, and when you want to start involving more and more people into achieving a goal together. So that's the moment when it makes sense to start articulating a strategy. I would argue that entrepreneurs, when they start, they do have a strategies in their head, and that's enough.
Right.
Yeah. It's an implicit strategy, but at some point you need to start getting. So what's your take?
No, but so I think you made an interesting comment now at the end. At the beginning, you said, well, you don't have a strategy, you don't need a strategy, but what it's really about, you don't necessarily need a kind of formal written down strategy, right? I would argue that you always have kind of a strategy. I'm a one-person business. I have a strategy. I ask myself the same kind of questions. So who should be my customers? What should I offer them, right? What are my ambitions? What do I need in terms of capabilities and to make it happen? So I think that's kind of the same logic, although I don't necessarily have it in a formal document, right?
But you don't need to go to this very formal process and so. But I think it would be interesting to explore the question. Well, what is strategy? And I don't know if we could actually ask, have people leave comments to say what do you. I mean, you and I have been doing strategy for a while, and I think you agree that there are relatively different views of what strategy actually is. So maybe we should have asked that question up front before asking, do they need it? Okay.
Yeah, so I agree. So if you ask 5 people, you probably get 5 different answers. Yes, and yeah. So to your invitation. So I'd like to all the participants just post a comment. So if you think about strategy in your organization, how do you define strategy, and also maybe in terms of barriers that you face when it comes to doing strategy in your organizations. Yeah. So what is strategy? Like, I mean, there are obviously different dimensions to that. Right? So I like to think about strategy as a way to overcome your challenges and seize opportunities on your way to your ambition, right? So I talk about ambition, but you can call it vision, mission, whatever. So when you have that kind of goal that you want to move towards, and somehow you need to think about how do I get there, right? And what are the barriers? What's keeping me from reaching my ambitions, and I need to go there. Now, so that's one part of the answer, I would say. The other part of the answer is obviously more on the content, really, that you need to think about your ambitions. You need to think about who are my customers, what am I going to offer them, where will I focus, what will I not do, why should customers come to me, what is my competitive advantage in that sense, if you like, what is the value proposition, and how do I need to organize myself, what kind of resources do I need, what kind of capabilities do I need, what kind of actions do I need, what kind of organization, processes, structures do I need to make all of that happen. So that for me is thinking about your strategy.
It's interesting. I'm checking the chat here.
Yeah.
So the two I see are a strategy as a plan, and a strategy
well,
to achieve a goal.
Also
so
a plan.
That's, if I look at, I have it. Where is it here? That's one of the. This was an interesting one for me when I found this, the strategy safari, where I discovered that you can have different definitions of strategy, and I think one of the most common is strategy as a plan. As to what consultants say, strategy as a process. I think we talked about that also.
Yeah. So the danger of that strategy as a plan is, I think that's what we see a lot in organizations, is this idea or this concept or the definition of strategy as long-range planning, right? Which
exactly.
Lots of organizations has kind of evolved really, or has been downgraded, you might say, into a financial budgeting exercise for the next 3 to 5 years. So it's, I mean, Roger Martin talks a lot about this. The plan is not a strategy. And even Mintzberg, I mean, you mentioned the book Strategy Safari. He wrote in, I think it was beginning of the 80s, there was an article, the rise and fall of strategic planning, where he talks about planning is not strategy. Right?
But I find that when we look at strategy, and I've had these discussions many times, is this differentiation? Well, this is strategic, this is operational. And I think this is dangerous, because then you look at strategy sort of ends at the high level, at the rough, and then everything that is sort of the, how do we put it in place? What do we actually need to do specifically? They count that, well, that's not strategy anymore. Or even you can even do it narrower when you say, okay, strategy is just a plan. So it doesn't include the goal setting, and it doesn't include the action behind it. Then you have a relatively narrow view of strategy, and then you have beautiful strategy documents, which you can see on many websites. That's our strategy, and it's an element of it. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's just an element of it. It's just not complete, and it's not very useful.
Yeah, so I would agree that. I mean, obviously, you need a plan in the sense of what are the steps we will take, right, in terms of doing our strategy, in terms of developing new products and all these things. So, but what I would be careful about is this idea of we need to plan out for 3 to 5 years, right? And we very often have that. I very often have that discussion with clients when we talk about strategy, and then I say, well, let's focus actually on what we can do in the next 12 months as a first priority, and then afterwards we think about what comes next. Then again, there are situations, obviously, where long-term planning makes sense. You know, if you want to build a new factory, or you create a new building, obviously that's something you need to plan a couple of years ahead, because it's going to take a couple of years to do something like this. But that's not necessarily strategic in the sense, I mean, the implementation of that plan is not necessarily strategic. The decision whether to do a new manufacturing plant and where you're going to put it and how big it should be and all of that is very well strategic.
I'm looking at the comment here from Andrea Stott, who says that in her experience, many companies use strategy as a set of goals, usually financial. And then the cycle of planning a direction is then put on side and everyone is consuming, managing the external. So that she says, I agree that operational and strategy have to be integrated to be useful for an SME.
Yeah.
And I think she has a right point there for strategy to be useful. I think it needs to have this element of operationalizing. That's why I have this. For me, one of the discoveries of the last few years was the book by Richard Rummelt. So that the kernel of strategy, and in the kernel of strategy, he says, well, we need to have a diagnosis, which is what are our challenges. Then we need to have some element of guiding policy, which helps us make decisions. But then at the end comes coherent action.
Right.
In my process, I then add ambition. What's aspiration? Because I like that in the work. It's always nicer to start with aspiration than to start with challenges.
Yeah.
And it sets up a bit. Challenges only make sense if you want to get somewhere.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's what I think too. Yeah, so I like Rummelt as well, and as I said, so I also tend to think about strategy as overcoming challenges or seizing opportunities. More from a pragmatic side, I would say maybe that's because I'm a consultant, but most of my clients, they come because they have a challenge that they need to solve, right? They don't necessarily, very, very seldom somebody comes and says, I want to think about where to take my company in the next 10 or 20 years, but they come because they say, I don't grow anymore, or we have to figure out what to do in North America, or we're losing market share here, or our margins are shrinking. So they have very specific problems, right? That they
yeah, from a sales perspective, I think that's when you make the sale, when people say we're stuck.
Yeah.
To some extent, it's like we don't know. But let's go to the question you had on the list, or we had on the list as well.
I mean, Andreas,
what are the obstacles? Or we want to
one comment. I think what Andreas said, there is an interesting element also there, where she says that the plan is kind of, or the strategy is put on one side when everybody is consumed with managing the external changing environment, right? So there is a little bit this idea of there's a gap between the strategy and what we actually do in our daily business, right? And that's also something that I hear that a lot in companies when it's about executing strategy. Well, we don't have time, right? Because we're so busy. How do you think about kind of closing this gap between obviously what you do should be your strategy, or you could even say, going back to Mintzberg, whatever you do is your strategy, and it doesn't matter what you have written somewhere else. Right?
The idea of emergent strategy.
Right.
I had a bit of a sobering experience a few weeks ago when we did. I like to work in quarterly strategy cycles, where we say, okay, we have a 3-year perspective, and then we work in quarterly cycles, and we have the year as a check-in. But long story short, we do this quarterly cycle and we decide on a strategy, meaning objectives, obstacles, and plan of action for overcoming that obstacles in view of achieving those objectives. And everyone was good. And then I asked the team, well, tell me on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that you're actually going to do what you just decided? And can you imagine what number they gave me?
Not very high, I guess.
Below 5.
Yeah.
Whoa, guys! What's wrong here? Yeah, we're coming into the busy season, and this is all very nice, but I say it's your strategy. You just came up. It's not something that I gave to you.
Yeah, right.
And this is an odd thing. I find that people are so almost, especially in small companies, they have this idea, we will be so busy that we will be lucky to do anything of what we've written down. And that's
kind of interesting.
that's something that I find is often my work is more to help them actually do what they're decided to do, and to focus on is what we're doing actually in line with what we decide? Is it aligned with our strategy in a sense of this was our idea? How we're going to
what we're going to do. Right? Yeah, I think so. I always used to talk about cascading the strategy, but recently I've also come more to that idea of aligning. If you talk about different teams or departments or functions, aligning whatever they are doing to the strategy. So I tend to think about strategy on a department level or on a functional level to really look at what are the activities that we are doing, what are the activities that we are currently engaged in, and how aligned are they with what we should be doing based on the strategy, and what do we maybe do less of, what do we completely stop doing, and what do we need to continue doing or even start doing new. And so it becomes really this focus on the activity. So in order to close that gap between we had a strategy somewhere, but our activities are spent somewhere else. Right?
Yeah, I think you mentioned something important here in terms of we have a strategy, we're not aligned. And another thing I see is that often people do a strategy exercise and then they're almost overdo it. I know you're not a fan of 2-day fancy. And I would tend to agree, because you tend to come up with like Moses down from the mountain.
Yeah.
With the tables. But yeah, exactly. But the sad thing is then they make a beautiful presentation and then they forget it, and then you meet them a year later.
Yeah.
And because it was such a huge exercise, it's not, they don't even look at the strategy.
Yeah.
So that's why, well, what did we decide? What is still working? So that's why I like the notion that Richard Drummel has this coherence. It should be coherent. Should it be aligned? Should it be cascaded? I'm getting a bit away from this cascading. I don't know how you see it.
Yeah, as I said, I talk more about alignment. So focusing on the activities that are being carried out throughout teams, how do they align and what needs to be aligned? How can they be aligned with the overall priorities really that we have defined in the strategy? It's kind of interesting. I just have a client now, and we're working on. So we decided that HR needs to work on the strategy. So based on what has been decided on the top level, and then the head of HR is very resistant to engage, or was initially very resistant to engage in a strategy exercise, because she said, "I'm too busy." Right? So why we should do this exercise so that you can actually focus on activities that are more important or more high value. There's a comment by Marcus here. Is it important to get bottom-up input into the strategy to ensure it's achievable? So what is your take on that?
I'm very much in favor, as long as you don't overdo it.
No.
To me, strategy is still something which is to a large extent a top-down activity. At least because you're giving direction, you're trying to plan. But by all means, I'm in favor of getting input. I'm also I like to get input, first of all, in what we consider to be the challenges, but then also, is this strategy or is this thing that we're formulating meaningful to us? And ultimately, it's important that people can identify with the strategy, that people have a sense of how can we contribute.
I like that.
I like the idea to have some input on on challenges, not so much aspiration. I would, because I think it's the role of the senior team to project where they want to move the company in the future. And if you try to do strategy by committee and involving too many people in that process, I'm just not convinced that the strategies that come out are particularly good.
No.
With input, yeah. I don't know how you see it.
No, I agree. When I was younger, I would always say we need to involve a lot of people. Just coming from that, systems thinking background and seeing organization as a living social organism, kind of you need to involve. And then I remember one. It was actually an owner of at the time I think it was like 50 people organization, and he would say, "Well, I'm not going to ask my 20-year-old accountant who has been with us for a month what the strategy for my company should be." Right?
Mm.
And I think he had a good point that you shouldn't ask. And I also learned in later exercises when we asked actually people, so what should the strategy be? I mean, it's overwhelming for most of them. You kind of put them on the spot. What should the strategy be, or what ideas do you have for ambitions and these things? But I agree that. So what I tend to do nowadays is involve relevant stakeholders at various points. So it could be employees, but it could also be partners, or it could be owners, or the board of directors, or whatever. Right? And so these key moments are to identify what are the challenges and the opportunities you see, for example, right? And then I would ask management to make a decision on, so which ones do we want to focus on and why? Why are those more important than others, right? And then once you have identified them, you can again ask people for ideas. So how would you address these challenges? Or how would you address these opportunities? And then I like presenting kind of like a draft. We always call it a draft of the strategy, and get feedback. So that kind of goes in the direction of, is it meaningful to you? Is it inspiring to you? What do you like? What don't you like? What concerns might you have when it comes to implementation? So we start already thinking about what is going to be necessary in terms of support and capabilities and everything for implementation. And then I also like to, the top-down bit for me is always more the kind of the strategic directions or priority areas, but then I'd like to involve people from throughout the organization in terms of, okay, and how are we going to do this exactly? What are the tactics, some people might call it, or how we're going to actually address these things, right? So that you give some autonomy and some meaning in that involvement on the how are we going to actually implement.
Where I see the bottom-up involvement also is, are we missing something? Is there something we're not seeing? Are we sometimes I work with a lot of very visionary people who come up with relatively good ideas, but they have this idea, well, now we just need to do, and don't realize, well, maybe on the level of capability there's something to do, or there's a level of, I don't know, that they're not close enough to realities, and then you come up with something that again is too distanced from the realities of the ground. And then you come again, like Moses from the mountain, and say, well, we've been here and you come with these lofty ideas. Are you realizing what we're dealing with on a daily basis?
Yeah, I think, it's part of being an entrepreneur. I think the personality types who become entrepreneurs or also CEOs of businesses, they tend to be more, the visionaries, maybe, and they are not so interested in all these implementation details, right? And they are not interested in the detailed planning, but they are more big picture kind of thinkers, right? So I think
they're the thinker, big picture, not so much detail. So they tend to be a bit less grounded. And I think that's also one of the reasons why often these strategy exercises are so disconnected. Because if you do it with these people and you start discussing in the minutiae of how we're going to implement it, or you don't need to, I don't think you need to have a very detailed implementation as part of your strategy process. I wouldn't go so far. But some element of thinking things through. And if I have these visionary types, they go all nervous. They've shared their views and everyone should get it. And
that's the other. Just yesterday we had I had a conversation with So was a training, and then we had somebody from senior leadership going in at the end to do a kind of like a roundtable discussion. And he actually mentioned this phenomenon that so management tends to work on a strategy for a couple of months or a year, right? And then they communicate it once, and then they think everybody should have understood it and kind of go to the same reasoning that they.
Yeah, absolutely. It took them really a lot of work inside and arguing, and then they have it, and people should just get it. And if they ask a question, say, well, it should be obvious, no?
Yeah, right. Yeah, they don't have. They haven't gone through the reasoning process.
When I look at the obstacles why people may not want to do strategy, I mean, we talked about why not do, especially in small companies. People, beside not having time, what are other obstacles you see? Things you see.
So I mean, is there no time? Bad experience with past strategy exercises where people say, well, it's just going to end up in the drawer anyhow, right? Nobody's going to look at it. And I think that's also partially the traditional consulting industry to blame, right? With creating 200 pages or slides of PowerPoint decks with what the strategy is supposed to be. Right? Nobody's gonna read that anyhow, right? There is also this, what you mentioned before, and I guess that's in smaller organizations probably even more pronounced, this idea, well, it's obvious anyhow, right? We know what the strategy is. But then if you look at research, there was an HBR article a couple of weeks ago that actually looked at how aligned are people in the company on the strategy. So they asked people to write down what is our strategy, and turned out that only like 23% were actually aligned, whereas management thought, 80% is aligned. It's fine, right? So there's a huge gap there. But then I think, I mean, at the end of the day, I really think that lots of people, even CEOs, I had a retired CEO the other day of a stock market listed company who admitted that, or who said that, Marc, when I was a CEO, I had a difficult time wrapping my head around this thing called strategy. So I think there is this lack of understanding what is actually strategy on the one hand, and how are we going to develop a good strategy? Because if you look at all the books, and all the frameworks, they are some are very good, let's say, in explaining what the strategy should be and what you should do maybe in terms of exercises. But I have hardly seen any book describe what is a process that you actually go through step by step. How do you go from an analysis to then actually formulating a strategy, for example, is something that's completely missing in lots of strategy books.
Yeah, or then they're too how would I say, too rigid in how you should do it.
No.
So even Rummelt, which I like it very much as a book, it's not very. You cannot use it as a handbook. Okay, let's now.
No, there's no.
It's not. You can look at it. You can take it and say, well, you can use it to assess your strategy. You can assess it. Well, does it have elements of a good strategy? Does it have elements of a bad strategy? But I would say yes. One of the problems we have is that often people don't see the usefulness of the strategy because they have an unclear understanding of what strategy actually is, because they've had bad experiences, and from that, as a consequences, it's logic that they don't see the usefulness.
Again, I think also the lack of usefulness is also rooted very much in this idea or this misconception that strategy is a lot about long-term planning, right? Especially today, where everybody says the environment is getting more turbulent. So they say, well, why should we do a strategy? Things change anyhow, right? But that's because you think about it as a plan, a long-term plan, and you don't think about it how it's going to help us solve the challenges that we are currently facing, right?
Yeah. I saw one exercise which I was really shocked when one company, I mean, in today's world, had a 3-year strategy, and it was all 3 years planned from one now to thing with all the activities. what a waste of time.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That's really a waste of time, and it's not only a waste of time. It's if you're going to follow that, you're actually going to be blind for 3 years because you're following your strategy.
Yeah.
And that's I had an interesting, and big companies have that. I give you an example from I was working for PricewaterhouseCoopers, and then I spent 1 year more with another company. You can see it in my LinkedIn which company it is. So I was hired to build a business on supply chain consulting. Okay. So I go out to the market and but the idea was essentially to grow a consulting business in Suisse Romand, so it's French part of Switzerland. Operational consulting business, and to build a certain advisory business in a particular market. Okay. And they had this idea, it's going to be supply chain. So I go and start talking to people, meeting people and so, and they say, Andreas, look, we're good on supply chain, but innovation, that's where we would be interested. And you have interesting offering on innovation. So we'd be more interested to talk about that.
Okay.
So I go to my superiors and say, look, this is the situation. There's an opportunity. There's not so much an opportunity in supply chain, but there is an opportunity in innovation. What should we do? No, we hired you to do supply chain.
Yeah, because that was the plan, right?
Yeah, you have a plan, but your plan is, what's your plan? Is your plan to build a supply chain, or is your plan to grow the business in general in that area? So depending on how you make it, of course, if you say our plan, our strategy is to build a supply chain thing, then that's your strategy. And then also you need to be careful if you're not missing opportunities. It's like
this idea of the strategies. I think it's also Mintzberg who said that in Strategy Safari, that if you you put on the blinders and you don't see what's happening.
I mean, quoting Peter Drucker, is you need to be open for surprises on both sides.
Yeah.
You implement something, you do something, and then you see what happens.
Exactly.
And then you say, whoa, this did not work, but we have this positive surprise. What does it mean? And then you go back. That's why
I build into strategy reviews. So we tend to do monthly strategy reviews where we look at are we actually doing what we said we do? So going back to what we discussed earlier about activities, right? And then is it leading to the results that we'd like to see or that we were hoping to see? And if not, is there anything, our assumptions not valid any longer, or are there any new insights coming up?
I'm looking at the comment here. That validation. Is there a challenge that SMEs think that you can't understand their business better than them? And then since I have a family business.
I have a good, so I guess that goes back to this idea of should you hire a consultant to do your strategy, right? So, and I've posted about this and done video about this in the past. So my opinion is that you should not outsource strategy work to a consultant, not to let's say a done for you consultant, where you actually hire a consultant and say, do the strategy for us. What I as a consultant can offer or do offer is I help you structure the process, I help you ask the right questions, I help you find answers, but I don't do the strategy for you, right? So it's really the responsibility of leadership to do strategy. And sometimes we hire traditional consultants for very specific things or for very specific topics where we might need a more detailed financial analysis than the company can do or provide, or we might need some market research, and we hire an agency to do that. But it's really the responsibility for the process and making the strategy rests with the leadership team.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that if the person I'm working with, who is in the business, doesn't understand the business better than me, then we have a problem. I mean, they are in that day in, day out. If I understand their business better than they are not in the right spot, then they should be fired. No.
Well, yeah, sometimes, I mean, understand it better. Sometimes an outside perspective also helps to clarify things, but obviously, yeah, they should know.
Yeah, it's an outside. I agree with the outside perspective, but fundamentally understanding of the how your business works, I would expect that that's the bit that the company brings in, and you bring in the outside perspective, you bring in the process, you bring in what are the assumptions between what you're saying. Sometimes in leadership team, I say that they're unspoken assumptions about why things are the way they are, and that's things you can challenge. I think that's where the value is in bringing in an outside consultant, and not to tell you how you should run your business.
Exactly. Cool, Andreas. I see that we are already a little bit over time. I mean, this has been great, and I think we should probably do another one, right, to keep on discussing.
Yeah,
I would invite everybody who's here today. So if you have any more questions, just put them into LinkedIn comments. The comments stay open after we have closed already, so you can do that. We can answer some there, and then let's organize another one, Andreas, where we continue our discussion. Any final word? Maybe a one sentence tip that you would give a CEO of an SME when it comes to doing strategy?
A tip, I'll hand the word over to you. I need to think about it.
Well, I think so. Yeah, one tip. I think something that we discussed is you actually need to take the time for it, right? So even if you think it's not important, you need to make it somehow a priority, because it really depends. Your business depends on how well your business goes. Depends really on whether you have a clear, good strategy or not.
Yeah, I would argue my tip would be do it, but don't overcomplicate things. And have a process. Have an idea of what you want to do. Have a process. Pick a framework. There are different frameworks out there. Do it, but don't overcomplicate it. And it's the dialogue is almost as important as the outcome. That would be sort of one of my biggest takes when it comes to strategy.
Cool. Just summarized it and put it into the chat. Great. So thanks everybody for being with us today. If you have any questions, if you'd like to reach out to Andreas or myself to follow up with the conversation, just reach out here on LinkedIn. You see our profiles on the LinkedIn events, and then looking forward to seeing you in one of the next sessions.
We could do that. I already have an idea of a specific topic.
Cool. Thanks, Andreas. Take care. Bye.
Marc, it was a pleasure. Everyone, all the participants, thank you very much for taking time, and enjoy the summer.
See you.
The summer days. Bye-bye.